Picture this. The year is 1250, and you're walking through the heart of a bustling medieval town. The streets are narrow, the smell of fresh bread drifts from a bakery, and just around the corner you hear the rhythmic sound of hammers, saws, and chisels echoing through the air. A carpenter is at work. But here's the astonishing part. There are no power drills, no chainsaws, no nail guns. Just bare hands, wooden mallets, iron tools, and knowledge passed down through generations. And yet, these craftsmen built cathedrals that kissed the sky, bridges that spanned rivers, and timber-framed houses that, in some cases, still stand today. How did they do it? What tricks did medieval carpenters use to construct such marvels without modern tools? And why do their techniques still inspire awe centuries later? The hook to this story is simple but powerful. We often think progress moves in one straight line. But when you see what medieval carpenters accomplished, you start to wonder if they knew something we've forgotten. Let's step into their world, where survival, faith, and ingenuity turned wood into wonders. To begin, imagine the challenge. Wood was the backbone of medieval life. It made homes, carts, ships, scaffolding, furniture, weapons, and even parts of castles. But unlike today, carpenters couldn't just head to a hardware store and buy pre-cut lumber. Trees had to be chosen carefully, cut down by hand, transported, and seasoned. The carpenter's first trick was not in tools but in his eyes. He knew how to read a tree. Oak for strength, elm for bending, ash for flexibility, and walnut for beauty. Carpenters selected timber not just by size but by grain, moisture, and even the way the tree had grown in the wind. They believed each tree had its destiny, and the skill lay in matching the wood to the task. Once the wood was chosen, the real magic began. One of the cleverest tricks medieval carpenters used was the mortise and tenon joint. Without nails or screws, they could lock two pieces of wood together with perfect precision. It's simple in theory, a tongue of wood. The tenon fits into a matching hole, the mortise. But the strength comes from how tightly it was carved, and sometimes secured with a wooden peg. This was no flimsy connection. It could hold the weight of entire roofs. Walk through an old timber-framed house in Europe today, and chances are those joints are still holding strong after hundreds of years. But carpenters weren't only building homes. They were shaping cathedrals. Think of Notre Dame in Paris or York Minster in England. Those soaring wooden roofs, hidden high above stone walls, were feats of engineering brilliance. Carpenters used a technique called scaffolding carpentry. They built giant wooden skeletons, temporary frameworks that supported stones while masons worked. But these scaffolds had to be precise, strong, and reusable. Carpenters built them using geometry, measuring by rope, compass, and chalk. Here's the incredible trick: they could calculate curves, arches, and angles without modern math tools. By using proportions, circles, and simple ratios, they created geometric harmony that even today architects study with admiration. Ships were another arena where medieval carpenters shined. Imagine crafting a Viking longship or a cog that carried trade across the North Sea. They had no CAD software, no blueprints on paper. Instead, shipwrights carved a single model board, a master plank that set the proportions for the entire vessel. From this one piece of wood, the ship's shape could be replicated, rib by rib, plank by plank. They bent timber over open fires to curve it into shape, a trick that required not only skill but also intuition. Too much heat and the wood cracked. Too little and it snapped back. Standing in a medieval shipyard must have been like watching a symphony of wood, fire, and sweat come together on the water's edge. And it wasn't only grand projects. There were tricks in everyday carpentry too. Nails in medieval times were expensive and often hand-forged by blacksmiths, so carpenters minimized their use. Instead, they relied on dovetail joints for furniture, wedge joints for doors, and clever locking systems that required nothing but wood itself. Even their tools were multi-purpose. A single adze, for instance, could shape beams, hollow bowls, or flatten planks. The carpenter's toolbox was small, but his knowledge made it limitless. One of the most human aspects of medieval carpentry was apprenticeship. Skills weren't learned from books, they were learned from masters, in dusty workshops and on chilly job sites. A young boy might spend years fetching water, sharpening tools, or holding timber, slowly absorbing secrets of the craft. Lessons weren't written, they were lived. A carpenter might say, "Feel the wood, don't fight it," or "Listen to how the saw sings. It will tell you if your cut is true." These weren't just tricks, they were philosophies, guiding hands to turn raw nature into art. But perhaps the greatest trick of all was the way carpenters worked with nature, not against it. They aligned beams so that the natural curve of the wood added strength to a roof. They cut joints so that wood expanded and shrank with the seasons without breaking. They used sap, pitch, and beeswax as natural glues and sealants. In an age before industrial chemistry, every solution came from what the earth provided. It was sustainable, practical, and astonishingly effective. We also can't forget the role of faith. Many cathedrals and churches were built as offerings to God, and carpenters often carved small marks, almost like signatures, into hidden beams. Crosses, initials, or symbols believed to protect the structure from evil. These weren't just buildings, they were sacred works. Imagine a carpenter high on a scaffold, risking his life to place a beam just right, believing his labor was not only for a roof, but for heaven itself. That human touch, that blend of skill and belief, gave their work a soul that still lingers in the wood today. The endurance of their craftsmanship is perhaps the strongest proof of their brilliance. Entire timber bridges survived centuries of storms, houses leaned but never fell, and ships crossed oceans before the age of compasses. Even today, historians marvel at how medieval carpenters achieved so much with so little. The truth is, they didn't have less. They had different ways of thinking. Where we rely on machines, they relied on patience, on community, on tricks honed by generations. So what can we learn from them? Maybe the greatest trick of medieval carpentry wasn't in the joints or the geometry, but in the mindset. They built for longevity, for use, and for meaning. They saw each project as part of a larger cycle, where the tree became a beam, the beam became a roof, and the roof became a shelter for families, faith, or trade. Their work connected human hands with natural forces, and in doing so, created structures that outlived their makers by centuries. When we stand today in a medieval timber, framed house, or under the soaring roof of an old cathedral, we feel something more than history. We feel the touch of those carpenters. Their sweat, their wisdom, their humanity carved into every joint and beam. And maybe that's why their tricks still captivate us. Because they weren't just building structures. They were building legacies. And so, the next time you pass an old wooden structure or walk beneath the beams of a medieval hall, pause for a moment. Look closely at the joints, the grain, the way the wood still holds strong. Somewhere in there is the handprint of a carpenter who lived 8 centuries ago, a craftsman who knew tricks we might never fully master. Tricks that remind us of the creativity, resilience, and heart that define the human spirit, even without modern tools. That is the true wonder of medieval carpentry.